Good morning, everybody. I hope you're all well. Thank you very much for attending this webinar this morning. I appreciate we are in the summer recess at the moment, and that I'm sure you would like to be on the beach somewhere. But yeah, thank you very much for coming this morning. We're just getting a few more people come in, so I'll just hold off for a minute until we start. If you could all just send me a question on the Q&A just to say that you can hear me okay, that would be great, especially as we had a bit of a technical difficulty in last month's webinar. It'd just be good to know that everybody can hear and see me, hopefully. Great. Getting some comments through now. That's great. Thank you. Oh, brilliant. Excellent. Thank you. Okay. I don't want to hold you up too much longer, so without further ado, I think we'll start. Hopefully everybody knows how to use the different Zoom functions. Obviously, if you've got any problems, just send a message in the chat or the Q&A. I'm hoping that we'll have some time this morning after I've finished my talk to go through any questions you might have. However, if you do still have any questions that weren't answered, or you think of something after the webinar's finished this morning, then by all means send an email to my colleague Karen. Her email address is at the bottom of the screen, hopefully that you can see there, and I'll display that email address up again at the end this morning. So to start us off this morning, we're going to be going through internal scrutiny changes. So not just obviously what the changes are that have come about in the latest Academy's Financial Handbook, but all of those that have essentially come about in the last couple of years, just because I think there's been a real kind of change there from the SFA. They're really putting more and more kind of scrutiny on not just the academies and trusts, but also the amount of accountability from trustees to be able to actually, kind of track everything that's going on internally to do with financial controls. And yeah, so let's just get into that. But before we do, I just wanted to launch a quick poll and just see who we've got with us this morning. So it's just two questions there. Just want to know what setting and phase do you work in, and what's your role. So if you wouldn't mind answering those and then clicking submit, I'll just leave that up for a few seconds. Great. Fantastic. Okay, is that everybody? Great. Okay, so we've got a couple of people from single academy trusts, multi-academy trusts, and then other. So if you wouldn't mind just putting in the chat or the Q&A what setting it is that you're working in, that would be great, just so I can get an idea as to who I'm talking to this morning. Excuse me a second. And I can see that we've got, right, okay, so it looks like the majority of those that are others are consultants, much like ourselves, I would imagine, but we also got CFO and trustees as well. Great, thank you very much. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to talk to you about to do with internal scrutiny. So just give you an overview as to what it is and why it is that trusts need to be doing this. So this is the way in which academies and trusts monitor its risk management procedures. Now, you might think, well, internal scrutiny is internal audit. That's not necessarily the case, and we'll talk about that more in a bit. But essentially, it's all to do with all of the risks in the trust, not just those that are financial. So it's a way of reviewing and informing where there are weaknesses in internal controls, what can be done about strengthening those internal controls, and then essentially having a way of tracking those weaknesses that have been identified, following through with changes to those internal controls to eliminate those weaknesses, and then essentially monitoring those ongoingly to ensure that actually that is no longer a weakness. And that's really, I think, what the ESFA are looking for from the trust, but also from trustees as well, to ensure that there is that monitoring going on there as well. The other thing as well is that obviously within the trust you would have an audit committee. If you're not a large enough trust, you would have normally a finance committee or a similar named committee, which would have the responsibility of an audit committee, and therefore that will actually link into the responsibilities of that committee, and essentially it can inform that committee of what the risks in the trust are. It doesn't always, obviously, there are kind of certain areas which internal scrutiny does focus on mainly, but essentially it kind of helps to guide and also inform, especially for your risk register as well, as a trust, what it is that are the key risks there for your trust. As I said before, it's kind of interchangeable or synonymous with internal audit. It doesn't, like I say, normally just take into account internal audit from a perspective of finance. So it takes into account things like safeguarding, things like health and safety as well, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. So the ESFA in its financial handbook published a list of musts, and I just wanted to talk to you about some of the musts around internal scrutiny, to make sure obviously that you're making the academy or the trust compliant there. So you have to have, as a trust, you have to have a program of internal scrutiny. This is something that I think internal audit has always been kind of something that the ESFA have been looking for trusts to do. However, there's now the new kind of reporting requirement on top of that. So the ESFA are really kind of looking at what it is that trusts are doing internally to make sure that they are actually compliant, and that they're monitoring these risks and dealing with issues and weaknesses as and when they come up. So the program of internal scrutiny has to focus on evaluating compliance. As I say, it's a case of that, the ESFA are really looking at this now, trusts and trustees, for actually delivering and monitoring this, for offering advice and insight. So this is, how you can improve on your internal controls, how it is that, your processes, your procedures can be improved on an ongoing basis. And then identifying the different categories of risk as well. So as I mentioned before, the internal scrutiny isn't just about financial risks. I think it's always going to play a big part of it personally, because obviously, one of the key risks around trusts is that you're going to have, that risk that for whatever reason, either cash flow, isn't there, or that, funding is being withdrawn. So, there's always that big risk around finance. And so obviously you want to make sure that your finances are well looked after, that you've got robust systems in place. But like I say, it's not a case of that actually that financial risk is the only type of risk that your internal scrutiny would necessarily be looking at. Another must, is that it needs to be a risk-based approach, as I mentioned earlier. So you have your risk register, which again is another must. I don't think it mentions that in the financial handbook, but I don't think it links that enough at the moment. I think that's something that they may want to be looking at in future versions of the financial handbook, to make sure that there is very much a key, kind of link there between the risk register and internal scrutiny. That they really do kind of drive one another, because obviously if you're doing internal scrutiny work and you appreciate that there is a risk in this area because there is a weakness, then that should then be informing your risk register to say, well, this is a key risk. And likewise, if you have a key risk, then your audit work, your internal scrutiny program should be focused around that as well. And there needs to be independence. So as trusts are required to have an independent internal scrutiny program. It can't just be a case of that, a staff member internally who, would be actually carrying out the procedures, or they would have the responsibility for these areas which are identified as key risks, and therefore having internal scrutiny work done around them, that they, would be able to carry out the work themselves. There definitely needs to be that kind of gap between whoever is doing the work on the ground, as it were, and who's actually checking and making sure that those systems, those procedures, those processes are being followed, but also that they are robust as well. So as I mentioned, so those were some of the musts. So these are some of the requirements, again, kind of part of the ESFA Academy's Financial Handbook musts. So as I mentioned in the last slide, independence is required. So these need to be independent checks. As I say, you can't just have somebody, working in that area, or even for that academy or trust, who says, yeah, everything looks fine. There's nothing, wrong here, because obviously, that doesn't give that kind of independent, that level of scrutiny that you need in order to improve and to ensure that compliance is happening. There needs to be somebody who's suitably qualified or experienced. Therefore, it's a case of and we'll talk about who it is that can actually be carrying out that in a later slide, but essentially it's making sure that whoever's coming in has actually got the appropriate level of skill and their knowledge, and therefore they're going to be actually be able to inform trustees when they're reporting to them of what it is that's been found, and how to and advise appropriately on how to improve their systems. So one thing that I think has been probably lapse, I guess, until recent years, is that actually, internal scrutiny should be actually, or at least the program of internal scrutiny should be agreed by the audit committee. I think what a lot of trusts have fallen into the trap of doing is appointing an external auditor, or an external internal auditor, as it were, who has the knowledge, has the expertise about kind of what it is they do. They'll have a program of work that they can be carrying out, and essentially it's a case of saying, well, this is what we propose to do, and then essentially for most trusts it's a case of, okay, well, you're the experts, as it were. I think that's a good idea. Whereas I think obviously if we're doing it the way I think the SFA intends, is that essentially, this work should be done, informed by the risk register, informed by the audit committee, and they should be agreeing what areas need to actually be looked at on, either termly visits or an annual basis, to ensure obviously that they are, capturing all those weaknesses, that they're improving where they should be. The checks need to be timely. So as I mentioned, there's a case of that you can do kind of termly checks. Obviously there's the requirement that you do things on an annual basis. So that there is an internal scrutiny report now that needs to be filed with the SFA. So that needs to be done on an annual basis at least. But essentially, it's a case of, as and when those risks are arising, they should be being added to the internal scrutiny program, so that obviously they can be looked at in good time, rather than just identifying a risk and thinking, well, it is a risk, but is it a key risk? Well, yeah, if it's a key risk, then it definitely needs to be, the work needs to be centered around that now, rather than kind of waiting further down the line. And as I mentioned, it needs to include regular reporting. So this will be reporting to trustees. The Academy's financial handbook kind of, again, I think it suggests at termly reporting. That doesn't necessarily mean that there will be an internal audit report given to trustees termly. However, each term or each meeting of the audit committee, or like I say, finance committee, that's delegated that authority and responsibility, they would be reported to normally by the CFO. So essentially that they can have an update as to how the program is progressing, what things have been picked up, and how that has actually been followed on. So essentially looking at kind of what areas, what weaknesses were identified, and giving an update on how those things have progressed, and how those weaknesses are being assessed. Next, so the different options for internal scrutiny, as I mentioned earlier. So these are the different types of people or services that trusts can buy or provide or have provided to them. So the first, I think, we're talking about larger trusts here, where essentially having an in-house internal auditor, somebody who is independent enough that can actually go around to different academies and do the audit testing, that can test the central systems. It could very well be an expensive option for smaller trusts, because actually employing an internal auditor full time could be something that is incredibly expensive. So I don't think that's necessarily talking to the majority of trusts, but obviously for those larger trusts, they may very well have an in-house internal auditor. And obviously the plus side of that is that obviously they would get to know the trust better, and it's a case of obviously they can work to the systems and the processes that the trust already have. As I say, downside is that would probably be the most expensive of these options on here. So you can also appoint a non-employed trustee. So if you are a trustee, then if you have the suitable qualifications, if you have the suitable experience around any areas of internal scrutiny, any areas that you believe need internal scrutiny work done in them, then essentially a trustee can be appointed, as long as they aren't employed, to carry out that work. Now, I think that trustees and governors do an awful lot of work, and for a non-paid position, they take time out of their busy lives to do a fantastic job as a responsible person for trusts. So it might be a case of actually asking a trustee to do that as well. Maybe a little bit much, but I'm sure there are trustees out there that would be more than happy to. And I think obviously if you do have trustees that are trained auditors, then that may be the way that you go. Benefit obviously is that, well, they're not actually being paid for this, because it's as a trustee, it's a voluntary position. Obviously the downside being that they may not be welcome to the idea of doing this as unpaid work, especially as there's a requirement to submit this to the SFA as well, so that they would be putting themselves up for more scrutiny themselves, potentially, by doing this. The next one being a peer review by the CFO of another trust. That's, I think, probably along the lines of one of the cheaper options. It's a case of actually if you have contacts with CFOs in other trusts, then you may want to do a reciprocal agreement whereby it's a case of you as a CFO or the CFO of your trust may want to go and do checks for other trusts, and likewise they would come back and do checks for yourself. Obviously, it's a case of finding CFOs who are open and willing and able to actually perform those checks. Again, you're required to have somebody who is appropriately qualified and experienced to ensure that obviously you are doing all of the things that the ESFA are actually requiring you to do. And make sure that it is obviously a robust kind of checking and that you're getting the right advice and the guidance as well. So it's definitely an option, I would say, but it's a case of you really have to find the right CFO and obviously ensure that they've got the right experience, the right expertise, and ensure they can provide that service fully. And the last one. By no means the cheapest, but probably the one that most trusts would go for is to actually buy in an internal audit service. Now that is quite often actually provided by internal auditors or firms of accountants or auditors like ourselves. So you would essentially come in, they would come in and do following obviously the guidance from the audit committee and the risk register. They would come in and do audit work. Obviously the upside is that they are professional auditors, they're qualified, that they have the experience. As I mentioned, downside is it's not the cheapest option to go for. I think it is probably the most popular. But the other thing being as well is that you need to make sure that you find the right auditors to ensure that they're going to give you the best advice and the best guidance, to actually work with you, rather than just kind of giving the trustees a report which doesn't actually turn into kind of practical guidance and advice going forward. Okay. So I just wanted to throw up another quick poll, if that's okay. And this one's got 3 questions. So if you can't see all 3 questions to begin with, if you scroll down, I don't know how it necessarily appears on your screen, but I know I definitely need to scroll down. If you wouldn't mind just kind of answering those. So the first one being how many times a year are your internal audit and scrutiny, I should probably say visits carried out. The second being how many times a year is your audit or finance committee reported to. As I say, it's a case of the financial handbook doesn't really say this is what needs to be happening officially, but obviously they do do say that it should be done regularly. And then lastly, who is it that's actually carrying out your program of internal scrutiny? I'll just leave that up there for a few more seconds, just to let everybody have a chance to answer. I'm just going to take a drink, just 1 second. Hopefully everybody's managing to stay cool. The last few days have been incredibly warm. So yeah, I know it's been a little bit sticky, but hopefully it will start cooling down now. Okay, great. Okay, thank you for those of you that voted. So yeah, so essentially everybody's mentioned that they're having 3 times a year, so it'll be 3 visits. Obviously with COVID restrictions and everything, I know that a lot of trusts have been doing this this remotely, which, having talked to auditors, they're finding it more challenging. However, I think overall, there's nothing to actually stop them doing the work. So yeah, that should be being continued regardless over the kind of summer term this year, and then obviously from next term, depending on how things go in the next few weeks, it might be a case of that actually internal auditors might be coming in, or they may still be doing it remotely in the autumn term, and we'll obviously wait to see what happens there. And then, yeah, so everybody's saying that they're being reported to 3 times a year on to the Audit or Finance Committee, which is great. So that's fantastic to hear. And everybody's saying as well that they're having a brought-in internal audit service. So yeah, like I say, it's a case of I think that's definitely the most popular way of doing it, just because obviously you're getting a professional firm there of auditors. Interestingly, nobody said that there was a mixture, and that was kind of a bit of a teaser question, which we'll come on to in a little bit, just to kind of see, hopefully, yeah, that you might think that there may be a different way of doing things going forward. Okay, so next, I just wanted to talk a little bit about what activities should be focused on. As I've touched on already, so it's a case of the audit committee or audit and risk committee should be deciding on what areas are actually being focused on. So and that can be not just financial risks. So as I say, if your risk register is full of non-financial risks, or your key risks are non-financial risks, then it doesn't make a lot of sense for you to be concentrating all of your efforts on actually doing internal audit work or internal scrutiny work around those financial risks. Like I say, I think it's always going to play a part, and it will probably normally play a significant part, because actually I think if any trust doesn't have financial risks as one of their key risks, then I don't think they probably know that is a key risk. I think it is a key risk, but yeah, so I would expect that would be on their list of key risks regardless. But it's a case of actually that the ESFA mentions that non-financial risks must be looked at as well. So it's a case of, if you have safeguarding risks, and I would imagine for the vast majority of academies and trusts that you are going to have safeguarding risks, and likely to be one of your key risks as well, that obviously there is internal scrutiny work done around safeguarding. Likewise, health and safety is more often than not going to be one of your key risks. Therefore, there should be internal scrutiny work done around health and safety. And actually how that works, we'll come on to in a little bit. So where there's been changes to previous procedures, so this could be financial again or non-financial, I guess probably one of the big ones that I've come across in recent times is where trusts have a change in their accounting software. So it's a case of they were following procedures that were around their existing software. So purchase order requisitions, purchase orders, that kind of thing. And then they buy into a new system, they implement that new system, and then it's a case of that actually there are new procedures that are following that new system. So it could be that all of a sudden your purchase orders are electronic as opposed to manual. It could be that authorization is now electronic as opposed to manual. And where you've had changes in those procedures to follow that new system, then obviously that would be an area that you would be focusing your activities on, to ensure that actually the new system or any new procedures that have been introduced are still robust, are, or could be actually improved upon, to make sure that actually everything that's being done is being done. So the other thing is that where weaknesses have been previously highlighted, so I think this ties in not just with internal audit and internal scrutiny, but where you've had external audits. So this could be your year-end accounts audit, where your external auditors have picked up maybe some areas in your financial controls that they have identified weaknesses in. It's not to say that your internal audit work isn't being done, it's just that they will have obviously a certain view on those controls, on those procedures that they're looking at around the financial statements. And so there are areas that they may be able to identify, and that again should be one of the areas that you're focusing on with your internal scrutiny. Likewise, if you've had potentially a safeguarding audit or a health and safety audit, then again you should be paying where there's been recommendations or where weaknesses have been identified. Then again, you should be looking at those areas to ensure that that those things are actually being addressed, that they're being strengthened and tightened, and that obviously going forward, that is it's a risk still, but it's not becoming an issue. And then other sources, I mean, I think I've highlighted most of the other areas where weaknesses could be highlighted, but if it's a case of that something happens in your academy or in your trust, all of a sudden, and it's a case of that wasn't necessarily identified as a risk before, where a weakness has been identified, if there's an incident, then all of a sudden that could well be added to your list of areas where you're focusing those activities on. So I've already touched on some of this, but I just wanted to kind of give you some of the real kind of key changes. So you might think this change had already come about last year. It had in a kind of hybrid way. So the internal scrutiny report to the SFA by the 31st December, you will have probably noticed that the internal audit report from your internal auditors would have actually been submitted to the SFA as well at the end of December last year. However, now that it is specifically that there is an internal scrutiny report itself that has to be reported to the SFA. So you can't just use kind of the last internal audit visit and the report generated from that as your report to the SFA. This is a very specific report to the SFA on internal scrutiny. So it will be looking at all areas, not just essentially your last internal audit visit. So obviously, if you're having internal audit visits now, it's probably worth actually asking if your internal auditors haven't told you already how it is or what it is that they'll be reporting to the SFA, or essentially giving to you to submit to the SFA at the end of December. Obviously, because I know that the external audit season is coming soon, and you just want to make sure that you get everything in place well ahead of time. The next thing I mentioned, so the FRC, which governs the ethical standards for auditors as well as accountants, they changed their ethical standard in December last year, and essentially have said that for academies and trusts is that if you have a firm who is providing your external audit services, that firm can no longer also provide your internal audit service. And I know that this has come as a big kind of shock and a headache, and you think, okay, well, that was announced last December. Why hasn't it been made more readily known throughout the sector? Well, the reason for that is actually the SFA only announced on the release of the Academy's Financial Handbook for 2020 that this definitely applied to academies and trusts. So the FRC said, look, this is for audits, you can't do external and internal audit. And it was a case of, the SFA had gone down the route of saying, well, it's internal scrutiny. And then there was back and forth between the audit firms and the SFA to say, well, does internal audit count as internal scrutiny? And the SFA definitely confirmed that when they released the Academy's financial handbook. So as I say, it's now a case of, if you have an internal audit firm, then they cannot be the same firm as your external auditors, and vice versa as well. So it's a case of that I think a lot of trusts now are looking at alternatives, and we'll talk a bit about where it is that you might be able to find internal scrutiny or internal auditors, to provide those services going forward. And then the last point on this slide is just to essentially say that if you had an arrangement prior to the 15th of March this year, like I say, that's actually way before the release of the Academy's financial handbook. So you kind of have to go do a bit of time traveling if you want to kind of really stick to this. But essentially, it's a case of if you had an arrangement in place with an audit firm that provided your external and internal audit, then you are allowed to essentially continue that engagement until the end of the arrangement. So for most trusts, then the internal auditors who are also providing their external audit will be doing the internal audit work up to the end of August 2020. And that's actually testing for periods up to the end of August 2020. So if they come in the autumn term to do their internal scrutiny, their internal audit visit, then they are allowed to do that as long as they are essentially doing it up to the period ending the 31st of August this year. That's because that's when normally your audit arrangements would renew. Therefore, if you're thinking, we haven't looked at other internal audit firms for September, then there is still time for you to, essentially keep using the internal auditors that you are at the moment, as long as they are doing their internal audit work up to periods ending the 31st of August. And I think, having talked to a few trusts, it's a case of, some of them are having their internal auditors do the work this term. Some of them are asking them to do it next term, just because of everything else that has been going on. But essentially, they are allowed to continue to do so, like I say, as long as they're actually only auditing up to the period ending 31st of August. And then obviously their internal scrutiny report would then go to the SFA by the end of December as well. So some are starting to look at other internal audit firms now, ready for the new year. Some are saying, well, we're going to look at it from January next year. But essentially, it's a case of, as long as you've got that arrangement in place before the 15th of March, then you are still allowed to continue that. But after that time, then you should be looking at a new provider. Just wanted to launch one more poll, which I will do now. So it was just basically to get your take on what it is that you're doing around these changes. And let me just leave that up for a few seconds. So, is it a case of that actually you're looking already? You've already got separate auditors for internal audit, or one of the alternatives that obviously the SFA have as an option. Okay, I think that's okay. Hopefully everybody's had a chance to answer and submit. Great. Okay, so everybody in the webinar today already has a separate internal audit service. So you are, more than welcome to, continue using your separate internal auditors. However, obviously, if you come to look at retendering either for your internal or your external audit, going forward, then do just keep in mind that you won't be able to appoint the same audit firm that provides the other one. So, you know, if you're retendering external audit, then you automatically have to discount the firm that's providing your internal, and vice versa as well. So yeah, just to keep that in mind. So thank you very much for that. Okay, so obviously if you're looking for your internal audit service, if you're looking for an external provider, I just wanted to give you some tips on what it is that you should be looking for, who it is that you should be looking for. So first of all, qualified accountants. As I mentioned, financial risks are going to be part of your internal scrutiny, and therefore, you know, qualified accountants are reasonably qualified. They are, you know, they're actually trained in doing this kind of thing, and therefore they're going to be one of your first ports of call. And I think where firms have looked to change providers from, you know, a firm of registered auditors or qualified accountants, then they would be looking for them to actually recommend them. So if you are looking for other firms, because obviously there's a bit of a mass kind of change at the moment due to the not being able to continue with the same firm for both, that essentially a lot of firms are kind of recommending each other. In some instances, auditors and accountants are part of a network, and in fact some are kind of saying, well, they're using a, you know, an internal audit program, which is actually, you know, similar to the one that we're using, or, you know, it's actually one that we share with them. So you know that you'll be getting the same kind of service, even if it's actually not the same firm that's providing it. Obviously, one of the other things that you'd be looking for is for, you know, firms that have got experience working in academies. So, you know, either it's a case of that, you know, as I mentioned, that, you know, somebody who's a CFO could be appointed as your internal auditor. Then it's a case of, you know, they would definitely have the experience. They might not be qualified. They may not be, you know, a registered auditor, but they would still qualify. So just finding a firm, finding a service which is actually provided by somebody who has experience in working in academies is definitely a must. You want to look for a firm that isn't actually just prescribing the work to you. You want to make sure that you're actually, you know, having that dialogue, making sure that your audit committee or your finance committee is actually, you know, not dictating but informing what the audit work should be that's being done. Ultimately, they hold responsibility for, you know, for the outcomes and for the improvement of internal controls and ensuring that robust controls are in place. So obviously you want to, they need to make sure that the work that is being done is actually informed by them and the trust risk register. Saying that though, it is important, if you do have you know, key risks in certain areas, that the firm that you engage to provide your internal audit service does actually have a defined program of audit work. It's a case of, obviously, you know, you want to make sure, you want to have you know, that comfort, that level of comfort, that essentially that it is that whatever, you know, whatever area that you're asking them to do, work around, that they do actually know, or they do actually have a kind of, you know, list of tests or things that they would definitely look at when actually carrying out that audit work. And lastly, I think this is kind of one of the SFA musts, and is definitely, you know, highlighted in the Academy's financial handbook, is that you have you have advice from your internal audit service. You're obviously required to comply and make sure that the report is submitted to the SFA by the 31st of August. You're making sure that you have regular meetings, you have regular reporting. All of those things are being done. But actually, if it's a case of that you're just having kind of those boxes ticked, then you're not getting the full value out of your internal audit service or your internal scrutiny program, because actually it should also be helping the academy or the trust to improve its controls and its processes, not just to essentially kind of, well, this is where you've kind of got these weaknesses, and then just saying, well, we'll check it again next time. It actually should be going into, well, what tangible improvements could be made. That's not to say that you necessarily have to carry them out, because actually the way that some academies and some trusts operate might not be conducive with whatever ideas or whatever advice that your internal auditors are giving. However, you should be looking for the advice and guidance. And I think for me personally, if I'm getting a recommendation from an auditor, I'm always looking for them to go to actually provide, well, what do you think is the best way forward then to ensure that we actually strengthen that area, so that we eliminate that weakness, and actually how do we improve, and I think that's really where it's a case of you get kind of the advice and the value, rather than just the compliance work that's done. And yeah, just to follow on from that, really. So it's a case of how do you get value for money from your internal scrutiny, from your internal audit service provider. So like I say, look at the risk register. Make sure that those are the areas that are concentrated on. Make sure where weaknesses are identified, and that key risks are actually picked up, that those things are added to the risk register. And I think one of the important things about going back to non-financial and financial controls is actually you may already be having other audits as an academy or a trust. So if you are having a health and safety audit, if you are having a safeguarding audit, or there may be other audits that you're having, those are quite often brought in by other service providers. They're actually being provided by professional firms, and therefore actually, do you need to have 3 visits per year on financial controls? So you want to try and find an internal auditor, if they are appointed as your internal auditor, that will actually be able to work with you and work with that as well. That's not saying that they necessarily will have the expertise to do those audits themselves, and you obviously want to make sure that you're clear on what areas that they will be looking at as internal auditors, and which ones that they can't, so that you're not essentially doubling or kind of paying twice for different audits, when actually you're already having 1 or 2 other audits done that are around your key risks, that are there on your risk register, and that essentially it's a case of actually, by doing that, you are being more compliant than if you just had 3 visits a year on financial controls. As I say, because of the ESFA must around having checks done around financial and non-financial areas. So that's kind of my next point really there on the slide. So only buy internal audit services for what you need. As I mentioned, there's no need to have kind of 3 visits a year from your internal audit service if you're having audits done in different areas. And making sure that your external and internal auditors work alongside one another. As I mentioned, areas of weakness that your external auditors are able to pick up on should be one of the areas that not just your audit committee and your internal scrutiny program is focusing on, but it should also be where if you're looking for advice and guidance, that your internal auditors should also be looking there as well. So that would normally come with your external audit management letter or findings document, to essentially make sure that they're concentrating their efforts on those areas. Obviously financial controls is a broad spectrum, therefore you want to make sure that they're actually focusing on those areas which the external auditors have picked up on, to ensure that obviously you're strengthening those areas where potential weaknesses have been identified. And yeah, kind of following on again, it's about kind of making sure that the amount of time that's actually being spent, what the reporting requirements are to deliver. So if it's a case of that your internal audit service is coming in for half a day per term, is that enough? Is that too much? And just think about, well, actually, would it be better if they came in for a full day to just concentrate on financial controls, but also to help with the reporting, where you're having health and safety or safeguarding audits done in other parts of and other times of the year. So and obviously making sure that if you're working in a trust yourself, that you're not spending too much time on this area, that you could be spent doing more important things. I'm not saying that internal scrutiny isn't important. It's just obviously if you're over egging it, then you could be overpaying, and you could also be overspending on your time to deal with this. And like I say, kind of just to reiterate again, so compliance versus advice, compliance is a must, and the advice is something that gives you the actual value out of your internal audit service. So it's about finding, like I say, a firm that can actually give you the practical advice, the actual kind of on the ground, this is how you would improve these areas, this is how you would strengthen these processes and these procedures, and working with you to ensure that obviously you're able to follow through with that. I think a lot of auditors are obviously they give you a price based on how much time they feel that the compliance work is going to give you. The compliance work that they carry out for you is going to take, but it's a case of actually what you want to make sure is that, well, you're getting the value out of that work as well. You're getting the advice out of that, and ensuring that any recommendations that they give you, you are able to actually follow through with that, and therefore it's a case of making sure that is really part of your internal audit service as well. So thank you very much for listening to my talk this morning. Hopefully you've learned something. Hopefully it wasn't all a big shock to you. Obviously, if you are already, as I say, employing or engaging a separate audit firm to do your internal audit, then there's nothing to stop you continuing on with that. But obviously just be aware that now there is an internal audit or internal scrutiny, report to be filed specifically to the ESFA. And so I just wanted to open up now to any questions that anybody might have. So if you want to either pop those in the Q&A or in the chat, then I'd be more than happy to go through those with you now. Obviously, depending on how many questions there are, we might overrun a little bit on the hour, but if you're happy to stick around, there are lots of questions, then I'm more than happy to answer. But otherwise, thank you very much for listening this morning. I just wanted to let you know before hopefully we have a chance to kind of get on to the next thing this morning, was that our next webinar will be in late September, and we will be looking to have that on preparing for external audit, what academies and trusts should be doing around that. I think obviously that would be very, very relevant at that time, as you will be looking forward to your external audit visit, or remote audit visit, I guess, as it may be. And we're hoping to actually have somebody from another firm of auditors who has a number of trusts that they look after, to actually come and tell you what it is that they will be looking for this year, to ensure that obviously you are suitably prepared for that. So like I say, if there's no questions, thank you very much for attending this morning. Just for anybody that didn't attend, or if you want to have a look back at this later, we will be posting a recording of this online, so you should be able to watch back, and that will be available on our website very shortly. Okay, so thank you very much, and yeah, speak to you and hopefully see you soon. Thanks.